Hey everyone, welcome to Neighbor Science, the only podcast about political economy and anime. I'm Ryan Salisbury, and today we are continuing the Seeing Like a State book club type series, and I have another new guest, Tura.
Hey, how's it going, everyone? Wait, no, you're the only one here. But hello,
Yeah.
audience, I am here.
So we're actually doing chapter 3 and 4 today, because chapter 3 is only like 11 pages. And I realized that when I was probably 3/4 of the way through it, and I messaged you, and I was actually suggesting we just do part of chapter 4, but I think this will work out better.
Yeah,
It
we
would be
could have
weird
done
to
just
split
part
it
of
up, I
it,
think.
but the part of chapter 4 that I'm most interested in is the very end. So I'm glad it worked out this way anyway.
Yeah. All right. Well, so chapter 3 is called Authoritarian High Modernism. I think that's what I wrote down anyway.
Yep.
And so he starts talking about the philosophy of high modernism, which, as he says, is given force of will by a highly centralized state, which is, kind of a new thing, historically speaking. We didn't have such like massive, powerful states prior to the modern era. And so I think it's a pretty unique set of conditions combined with the philosophy that's used to drive it. He notes that pre-modern states had the modest ambition of extracting wealth for their upper class and fighting wars and little else. But in the modern era, we saw breakneck revolutionary change in human techniques, including steam power, power looms, mass manufacture of steels, railroads, electric lights. I would add chemistry, flight, just tons of stuff. And
Yeah. I was going to say, so much of that was over the course of like a single human lifetime. It's just all of this progress all at once.
Right. And because of exactly that, Scott points out that it would have been hard to live during that time and not be a modernist by the time you're, older, because you would see like all these totally crazy changes that were just unprecedented. I think this is actually captured really well in one of my favorite recent anime, Demon Slayer. There's an episode where the main character Tanjiro goes to like a new city that has electric lights, and it's nighttime, and he's like,
"The big cities have come a lot further than I expected. It's nighttime, but it's so bright out. The buildings are so tall. What's the deal? Incredible and overwhelming." This is making me dizzy.
and there's another episode where Inosuke, who's like super like country bumpkin kind of guy, he sees a train for the first time and he thinks it's a monster and starts attacking it.
It's such an intimidating size. There's no mistaking it. It looks like it's asleep, but don't let that fool you.
It's a train. You've never seen one?
Punch out, or you wake it. I'll lead the charge to take it down.
Inosuke, stop!
Huh?
This might be the guardian spirit of this land, so we shouldn't be attacking it carelessly. I said it's a train. You've never seen one either?
But anyway,
Cool.
So Scott identifies 3 characteristics that he says led to many of the like massive scale atrocities of the 20th century. And I'm just going to quote directly from him. Number 1 is the aspiration to the administrative ordering of nature and society, an aspiration we have already seen at work in scientific forestry. So going back to chapter 1 with the normal bounds. Number 2 is the unrestrained use of the modern state as an instrument for achieving these designs. And number 3 is a weakened or prostrate civil society that lacks the capacity to resist these plans. Which, that is like a pretty, I think it's a pretty interesting schematic of a lot of 20th century atrocities.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting that like the prostrate civil society often goes hand in hand with like the strongest military force that the country has ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
So the people on an individual level are often like more armed and powerful in that sense than they've ever been. but in the relevant sense, they're weakened, and it's the state that wields that power, not the people themselves.
That's a really good point about the militaries, because I don't think everyone realizes that like standing armies are like really new. Like, as far as I know, most armies historically were basically like created through conscription. Like you would have like a warrior class that was persistent, but the majority of the like foot soldiers would be peasants that were what's the word? This is why I need to play more Crusader Kings.
Yeah.
I would know this word.
Did a history on ancient Rome course at one point, and like all these terms are around, but it's been years. I don't know.
Levies. That's it. Okay.
Levies. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So from everything that I've read in pre-modern history, most armies were created through levies, which were, conscriptions of peasants, kind of facilitated by the lords of, various manors. They would have like an obligation to, a higher level of lord, I guess. And they would have to conscript a certain number of peasants.
From their local land holdings.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So continuing, he says, there's a certain current of utopianism that led to many of the great state-sponsored calamities of the 20th century. The first example that he gives is kind of weird is Nazi Germany, which he calls the diagnostic example. I mean, I guess I guess it is utopian in a really like evil way. It was just kind of off-putting to me. I don't know about you. When I read that, I was like, ooh, I don't know if I would put that first, but.
Yeah. I don't know. It was utopian in a different sense, but there definitely was that undercurrent, or maybe not undercurrent, aesthetic more, of the great fatherland of the master race that will rise following the war. And so there was sort of this utopian aspiration to it. It just didn't make any pretensions to offering that to more than a very small group of people.
And it was also kind of more like a revanchist or like aspiration to like restore a past that didn't exist, right? Like that's one of the major elements of fascism, is they create this like mythological history that they've had taken away from them, and that's what they're seeking to restore. Whereas like when I think utopianism, I think looking to the future, creating something that has never existed before.
Yeah, I think of it as sort of a bright future where everything is better and everyone's happy and fulfilled, which is not something that they were going for. But
yeah, I think a better example to me, we mentioned this in the first chapter episode or the second chapter episode, the like 4 great pests, where they're like, oh yeah, we're gonna get rid of all these things that have been plaguing us for centuries, and it was a really like kind of utopian project, but it was very detrimental, when it actually happened. But I don't know. I guess not worth like fighting about, because he moves on pretty quickly from this. So he also lists as examples of these calamities. Number 1, social engineering under apartheid South Africa. And I meant to look up most of these, but I didn't end up having time. Modernization by the Shah of Iran. Number 3, villagization in Vietnam, which I did look up. I'll talk a little bit about that after this list. And 4, huge projects in late era colonialism, such as the Gezira scheme in Sudan, which that one actually, I don't know why I didn't look that one up, because that sounds the most interesting to me. Maybe just because it's a word I've never heard before. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah.
By chance?
No, I think I've heard the name Gezira scheme thrown around, but I have no more detail than that.
Oh, it looks like it's a huge like irrigation project. Because,
okay.
Yeah, it says irrigation canals of the Gezira scheme from space. It actually looks kind of cool. I'll post it in the general chat. But I'll talk about the villagization real quick. So villagization is actually just a general euphemism for forced resettlement. Like, it's happened in a ton of places. And I think what he's referring to is called the Strategic Hamlet Program, which was something the South Vietnamese government did in an attempt to isolate rural Vietnamese from the Viet Cong and basically stop the spread of communism. So they started by identifying and training self-defense forces in various villages who would have the job of enforcing curfews, checking identity cards, and rooting out communists. And the other part of the project is attempting to consolidate 16,000 of Vietnam's villages, which that's a crazy number, into just 12,000. So they basically were trying to like force everyone to leave their home and move into a smaller number of villages to make it easier to manage them and keep communism from taking over.
Yeah, higher density, more order, easier policing. We'll get to that.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I studied Vietnam War stuff, but like the US military is pretty well known for having committed a whole whack of atrocities to the locals while they were there. And what's interesting about it is a huge proportion of those, like the aggressive brutality and killing of babies and raping of women and that kind of thing that happened wasn't to the North Vietnamese. It wasn't to their enemies. It was to these people in South Vietnam who they were ostensibly on the side of through these kinds of coercive projects that put people in close groups and then put a massive spotlight of surveillance and interrogation on everyone to stop the communism from spreading.
Yeah, so they carried out Operation Sunrise, which was the name for the forced relocation program. It began in March 1962 in Bun Nhung province, which is an area with a particularly strong Viet Cong presence, which like they had advisors that were like, don't start there. That's the worst possible place he could start because that's like the Viet Cong stronghold. You should start in a place with like low sympathies, but they did that anyway. USAID sponsored the operation by giving each family that was forced out of their homes a reparation of $21 for the land that they lost.
Incredible.
Yeah. So the South Vietnamese army initially forced 210 families to leave. And according to records, so it might have been worse than this, 140 of those 210 families were forced at gunpoint. And the practice continued through the end of April. The operation was extremely unpopular, obviously due to the unwillingness of families to leave their homes, but also because the army was like killing civilians that were too resistant, as well as suspected Viet Cong. And also, when they forced the people out of their villages, they burned them down. In fact, it was so unpopular that even U.S. soldiers sympathized with the villagers.
Wow.
Yeah.
So they kicked them out of their homes and then did scorched earth on the way back?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
In Against the Grain, Scott's other book, he talks about forced relocation in that sense actually being very common historically. If a state wanted to get a large subjugated workforce, they would do exactly that. They would force people out of their homes and destroy their homes so they couldn't go back to them and move them somewhere else where they weren't as familiar and would therefore be easier to control.
Wow.
Yeah, but I guess in this case, it was just to stop the spread of communism, not to get a forced labor group.
It's a good thing that forcing terrible material conditions on people in order to get them to join the military more readily doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah. All right. So back to the book. Revolutions and colonies, according to Scott, are particularly susceptible to authoritarian high modernism. In revolutions, because the ancien regime has been overthrown, which leaves civil society prostrate, and the revolutionaries have popular mandate to make sweeping changes. And then in colonies, for fairly obvious reasons, the old society has been conquered by colonizers, and I don't think he mentioned this explicitly, but I think it's a fairly straightforward conclusion that like the in-group, out-group dynamics of colonizer and colonized means a high willingness to experiment on the colonized population. So So they're willing to make sweeping changes on behalf of the people they've conquered. So he then raises an obvious question, which is, where did authoritarian high modernism originate? And he speculates that it's the German engineer Walter Rathenau, who was chiefly responsible for the power of the German army in World War I. So he created huge logistics networks and a meticulously planned economy to provision the army, which to most onlookers, they expected the army to run out of steam very quickly. Oh, I also put ha 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 when I said steam because steam power. Anyway, so he says the intellectual current springing from Rathenau manifested in two more familiar traditions that kind of still persist today. One was the American tradition of Taylorism, where production processes were deconstructed into discrete, simple actions that resembled what we think of as a machine and were tweaked or rearranged for ease of management and productive efficiency. And then the other was the European field of energetics, which conceived of work as a series of energy flows and reduced the many real differences in workers to an undifferentiated abstract worker. And when I tried to look this up, I couldn't find anything. And you figured out that they were talking about ergonomics.
Yeah, at one point he says that they're the same, or energetics is called ergonomics sometimes. I think that's in the next chapter about Lenin. But yeah, it's this... There's a couple different traditions there. Some of it comes from American thinkers, but Scott locates it in Europe at the time.
Yeah, it was confusing too, because right after this, he's talking about their traditions, and he mentions technocracy, which is also American, and he puts it next to Taylorism.
Yeah, that's right.
So he says the ruling class of the late 19th and early 20th century, no matter what their other beliefs, universally subscribed to the ideologies of Taylorism and technocracy. And I don't know about you, but I think it's still the case in the U.S., at least for technocracy. Like everything to the statesmen that compose the U.S. government, they kind of treat everything as like an apolitical technical problem.
Yeah, just something to, you get a study done, you do some research, get some good evidence-based practice, and everything's supposed to just flow from there.
Yeah, task forces and etc.
Yep.
If we have the right amount of means testing, then welfare will just become super efficient, and we won't have to worry about people being left behind or imaginary budget problems that don't actually exist. And so, yeah, here he mentions Lenin, who was initially opposed to Taylorism and called it the exploitation of sweat, and later became an enthusiastic supporter of it, seeing its improvements of the productive forces as the basis for socialism. Which, of course,
yeah,
socialism was about making stuff, so that makes sense.
Yeah, the development of productive forces and that sort of Marxist teleology that requires society to progress through its stages and develop enough before it can move on.
Right.
I mean, it's pervasive. So then later on, and I think it's later on, whenever Scott talks about the Russians planning the economy and getting into the Bolshevik congresses to figure out how to run their factory system and all that, you're split. You're either a Taylorist or you're an ergonomist or energeticist, I guess is what he said. And there's no option for people not being viewed as sort of mechanical devices to be solved at a technical level.
And I wonder if that's just kind of an effect of statecraft at a high level. It's kind of impossible to, I don't know, maybe it's not impossible, but it's unlikely if you're kind of controlling millions of people from on high. It doesn't really bode well for thinking that people are people and not little parts of a really elaborate machine to be managed.
Right. It's, yeah, I mean, if you're going to manage the people from the perspective of a state, something about seeing them that way, legibility. What are we talking about again?
So Scott ends the chapter with saying he won't discuss every obstacle to high modernism, but does specifically mention liberal democracy. This, I think, is the most liberal he's gotten in the book so far.
Yep.
So he says there are 3 reasons that liberal democracy is resistant to authoritarian high modernism. One is belief in the existence of a private sphere of society that the state cannot legitimately interfere in, which is not the same as the private sector. It's referring to like personal life, sexuality, family, etc.
Yeah, the government doesn't belong in the bedroom or whatever.
Yeah, which, I mean, it does, obviously. I don't know what he's talking about. That's lib shit. 2 is belief in the independence of the private sector, which should be free not only because it like deserves to be, but also because it's simply not possible for a state, as in government, to manage such a complex sphere of activity without causing catastrophe. Which
didn't stop some from trying.
Yeah. When I read this, I thought he was being kind of like sarcastic or, not really agreeing with them. But I think after the next chapter, he probably actually does agree with that, to a degree at least. And so 3 is the existence of working representative institutions through which a resistant society could make its influence felt. And later he explains it. The freedoms of speech, of assembly, and of the press ensure that widespread hunger will be publicized, while the freedoms of assembly and elections in representative institutions ensure that it is in the interest of elected officials' self-preservation to prevent famine when they can. So he's talking about how, like, famine is one of those things where liberal democracy prevents it, which I think I agree with that the least, because like the USSR stopped having famines after Holodomor, but I don't think you would classify it as a liberal democracy.
Yeah, no, I read that as like, if they do take action or fail to take action, your representatives don't stop the famine, then you can vote them out and replace them with people who are more invested in stopping famine. And so in that sense, he's seeing this as sort of a check that the people can place upon the liberal democracy, or at least the elected officials. So if any of those representatives were committed high modernists who wanted to just plow through and be hardline authoritarian status, they would be voted out if there was a famine. That's the premise. I don't know how much I agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's a little crazy. I mean, like, we could use George W. Bush as an example, who did plow through all these like crazy oppressive measures after 9/11 and got reelected. No
right.
problem.
It's kind of hard to believe that this sort of system of checks and balances that supposedly exists in liberal democracies, like how you can live under one for all these years, and like you don't have to go far back in history. It's just how long you have lived under the system as it exists, and think that those checks and balances work, and that it's going to stop the supposedly elected representatives from, just doing what they want and making their own interests the priority.
Yeah, I mean, this wasn't long after Reagan, he was a 2-term president, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And to me, like, the thing that actually stopped famines from happening wasn't liberal democracy. It was intensive agriculture and, industrial production of nitrogen and pesticides, which, while it does prevent famine, is also extremely deleterious in a lot of ways, including depleting topsoil, causing nitrogen loading, which causes like algae blooms and shit like that, and is ecocidal, and it is basically like causing the collapse of like bird populations and pollinators and all that. So kind of a trade-off.
If you're looking at it in terms of raw efficiency, we need to do everything we can to stop famines from happening. Then we need to have readily accessible stockpiles of cheaply made food as efficiently as possible. And it's no wonder then that monocropping is what comes up as the solution to that, which is not a long-term stable thing that will prevent famines. So it's this weird conflict.
Yeah, it's kind of another one of those utopian schemes, isn't it?
Yep, it is.
All right. So that was the end of chapter 3. Like I said, very short. So chapter 4 is the High Modernist City, an experiment and a critique. So this is where he gets into some really fine detail about authoritarian high modernism and its effects and limits and all that. This is what Sam was building up to. Le Corbusier is like the main focus of this chapter. So Le Corbusier was an artist and failed urban planner who was active from the 1920s to the 1960s. His early politics, this is a direct quote, his early politics was a bizarre combination of Sorel's revolutionary syndicalism and Saint-Simon's utopian modernism. And Scott goes on to say that if one needed a caricature of modernist urbanism, you could hardly invent a figure more apt than Le Corbusier.
Yeah, I first read this book on audiobook, and so I didn't get to see the drawings that were in the book until recently, sort of going back over it to prepare for this. And wow, is the caricature word is right.
Yeah, I was very surprised when I saw those. I was like, the other figures in this book are like pretty elaborate. Like the cadastral maps are like, they look nice, even though, you know, their purpose obviously isn't. But I feel like Le Corbusier's drawings kind of suck. They're not that interesting to me. I don't know about you.
Yeah, it looks like some weird piece of concept art for a really boring video game. Like, that's how I saw them.
Yeah, especially the Buenos Aires one, which is just like 5 rectangles with a line and some stippling around it.
And I can sort of see this sort of utopian and high modernist vision of viewing things from the sky, that being like a better perspective, the top-down design of a planner. But why did he think that taking the shot from the perspective of a ship that's way out in the ocean and just seeing a couple rectangles jutting up from the coastline would be, like, how is that a good look? I don't understand what he was going for with that.
I have no idea. I didn't think of this until just now, but I guess I have to remind myself, he didn't have access to like drawing software, so he's doing these by hand. So maybe that makes some sense out of how like kind of dull they are. But I don't know.
Guess
people have
if he was a
more
trained
elaborate
artist,
drawings than that prior to this era.
Right? No, I think this was what he was going for, was the sort of aggressive, not brutalist, but sort of brusque simplicity of his designs. I think it was completely on purpose.
Yeah, he is very... I keep thinking simple-minded, which is obviously like has a different meaning, but like he was so focused on like overly simplifying everything. He was obsessed with it. Aggressive
simplification.
Yeah.
The rectangles, the squares, the 90-degree angles, nothing more complex than that.
This motherfucker loves rectangles. Yeah, so Scott shows those concept drawings. One is for Paris. I think that's the one that looks the best out of the 3. Maybe the Rio de Janeiro one, but that one still mostly is just like a road, and I don't really understand where the housing complex is supposed to be. And then the other one is a new business city in Buenos Aires. So what Scott finds noteworthy about it is the fact that no accommodation is made for the existing city's land or culture, which is true. Like, you look at the concept drawing for Paris and nothing about it looks like Paris. It just looks like a generic city. Like you said, for a video game, like that makes the most sense out of it, actually. It's like, it looks like a completely constructed world that has nothing to do with Earth.
Yeah, Scott talks about that. He says, like, all of his designs are placeless, with no regard for like the context or history of where they come from. And so any of his designs, if you're looking at what he planned for Paris, it could be anywhere. It doesn't matter that it's Paris. He doesn't care of what Paris was. In fact, he would more than happily raise the entire existing city to the ground and build his new plan entirely on a artificial constructed flat plot of land.
Didn't it say at one point that like he actually was rejected? I think it was for the Soviet city. He was rejected by the government, and then he like took the same drawing and just removed any references in the description to Russia and brought it somewhere else and was like, yeah, I got this cool design for your city.
Yeah, that was, he had a plan. I think it was for St. Petersburg. It was either St. Petersburg or Moscow, one of the big urban centers. Didn't go through. And then that plan became his model for Paris in, what was the book called? Shining City, La Ville Radieuse. That's what it was.
Oh, and the other thing that Scott notes is that they're designed to have imposing forms, but only when seen from the vantage point of a ship or an aircraft or like, you know, a helicopter, basically from like an administrator's view, someone who didn't live in the city.
Yeah.
I will say, though, to me, his understanding of what a city is in the abstract is like kind of accurate. I mean, it's obviously very reductive, but like he correctly identifies the authoritarian state-centered purpose of a city and like the fact that it's like a site of command where, you know, orders radiate from the government and business districts to like commercial districts, suburbs, and outlying rural areas. But because it's a human living space, it's also a site of like sociality, culture, and spontaneity, which he conspicuously does not understand and hates.
Yeah. And you get the whole dynamic where basically all of the high modernist state or city designing projects that actually were constructed, almost all of them were themselves administrative centers. They were built by the state for the state. Now, if Le Corbusier had his way, he would have done that to every damn city. So it wasn't limited just to like explicit state purposes. But yeah, I don't think it's an accident that the ones where this most happened were the ones that were explicitly for the state's purposes.
No one's a worker. Everyone's an administrator. We all just administrate each other. That'd be kind of fun, I guess. So yeah, his authoritarianism was like extremely overt and superseded any other political alignments he may have had. So I'm going to quote, I won't read the whole thing, but I'll read a good amount of this. So he says, this is how he described the business center for his Plan Voisin for Paris. From its offices come the commands that put the world in order. In fact, the skyscrapers are the brain of the city, the brain of the whole country. They embody the work of elaboration and command on which all activities depend. Everything is concentrated there. The tools that conquer time and space, telephones, telegraphs, radios, the banks, trading houses, the organs of decision for the factories, finance, technology, commerce. The business center issues commands. It does not suggest, much less consult. I thought that was very interesting.
High modernist domination of, I mean, everything. Nature, humans, the world that they live in. It is all to be constructed according to the plan, and there shall be no question or other comment.
And I mean, he's not wrong that that's what is happening. It's just the fact that he thinks it's good that sucks.
Yeah. He's got this interesting ability to sort of correctly identify and diagnose what we would consider problems. And he just goes all in on them.
Yeah. And further in the passage, it says, in condemning the rot, which was translated from la pourriture of the contemporary city, its houses and its streets, he singles out the factory as the sole exception. So he thinks that everything in cities is bad except for factories, which are good.
We're back to Taylorism.
And later on, Scott says, throughout his career, Le Corbusier is clearly aware that his kind of root and branch urban planning requires authoritarian measures. A Colbert is required. Do you know who he's talking about? I don't know who that is. Colbert. Or is that a title? I don't know.
I think it is a title. Can you highlight it? Oh, there, Colbert.
Of course, all I can find is
surname.
Stephen Colbert.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is meaning like a, what's the word? Like an alderman kind of thing, the sort of director of the area. So it's either a title or it's referring to a person who held a position of that kind of power.
Yeah. But he says on the title of his major work, one finds the words, this work is dedicated to authority.
Yep.
Like authority.
You could not be more straightforward with it. I just found what the word Colbert comes from, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Jean-Baptiste Colbert was a French statesman who served as the first minister of state from 1661 until his death in 1683 under the rule of King Louis XIV. He had a massive impact on the country's politics and markets. And there's, Colbertism or Colbertism, really strong top-down mercantilism and state planning.
Got it. Yeah. And for those who aren't super historically inclined, Louis XIV was the Sun King, extremely like authoritarian king that kind of centralized the state a lot, which makes sense that, his minister would have been an idol for Le Corbusier. And it also kind of, I think, goes back to the Lewis Mumford thing of worshipping the sun or elevating the sun as something that's the most important is kind of a hallmark of extremely authoritarian societies. You know, they center everything around the sky or the single star, and from that follows the rest of hierarchical society coming down from a single ruler. So Le Corbusier exhibited designs for the League of Nations, lobbied the Soviet elite to accept his new plan for Moscow. So it was Moscow. And did what he could to get himself appointed as the regulator of planning and zoning for the whole of France and to win the adoption of his plan for the new Algiers. So, he basically just shopped around to different authorities trying to get them to let him, demolish a whole city and rebuild it like his drawings. And I think his fascist cop brain ideology is pretty well summed up by this, 80s cop movie ass quote, which is, how many of those 5 million, those who came from the countryside to make their fortune, are simply a dead weight on the city, an obstacle, a black clot of misery, a failure, of human garbage.
Shove everyone into the cities and then design the world around them to control them the way that you want.
All right, so now we get into Brasilia, which is supposed to be a modernist planned city project, designed after the principles laid out by Le Corbusier. Oh, and I guess we didn't really go over those principles, but we'll cover them here. It'll become pretty obvious what the principles were from our description here. So the city was built at the behest of President, is it Juscelino Kubitschek? Is that how you pronounce it? I don't know.
Kubitschek, yeah.
Okay. So he was a SOCDEM president during the 50s who wanted to create a new administrative capital of Brazil, like Tura said, designed by Lucio Costa, who was a student of Le Corbusier. It's an administrative city, and he wanted it closer to the actual center of Brazil as opposed to the coast, and he wanted it to not be weighed down by the problems of the older cities of Brazil, by which I think he probably just meant the slums.
Yeah, Rio de Janeiro being busy and having emerged naturally rather than having been planned top down, considered it just a waste bin of human garbage and hated it.
Yeah. So because the city was located far from the coast and far from other cities that existed, the land was owned entirely by the state, which means the normally unrealistic requirements of a modernist planned city, which has to be built from scratch, were actually met for once. So in theory, the plan was utopian, and it was definitely modernist. The housing was egalitarian, so everything was organized into these giant apartment blocks called Super Quadra. They had 360 units each, and they were supposed to house up to 2,500 people. The traffic flow in the city was maximized and optimized. And that reminded me of this roommate that I used to have. We always used to say maximized and optimized to make fun of him, because he would say either of those words all the time, just about. He basically used them to mean doing something. The one time that sticks out that he did that was, my mom gave me this box of bowls, like weed bowls, and I let him have one of them because there was like a ton of them. Most of them were made out of stone, and they had like a huge air hole in them that was like impractically large. But so he told me one day when I came home, hey, I maximized the airflow in your mom's bowl. And when he showed it to me, what he actually did was he just crumbled up a pipe screen and shoved it in the hole.
That is the opposite of maximizing. I don't understand. Like, even if you think that makes it better, which I guess, a screen is going to be blocking airflow. Okay, this is not James Scott. Let's talk about this book.
Yeah, that just made me laugh thinking of that. So the layout of Brasilia was based on clean, smooth lines. It looks kind of like a crossbow. There's like a big central boulevard that, I mean, obviously it's not vertical because it's on flat ground, but the picture is vertical. And there's like a big like bow shape where all the buildings are. So there was that. There's spaces that are used for a single purpose. That was one of the major principles of Le Corbusier. He wanted cities to have a residential district and a commercial district and a business district, and no mixing of those things. So kind of like the Sim City skylines version of reality.
Yeah, you have everything is blocked into a single purpose. So residential and like there's a leisure section, but you wouldn't have restaurants and shops near the leisure section because that's not what it's for. And so everything is just broken up.
Right. So another thing, the city center was like a big imposing monument. A lot of Le Corbusier's designs, he would take an existing city design and be like, oh no, there's residential space in the center of the city. That's bad. We need to replace that with big monuments. There was one bit that said like he took a city center that was like several hundred acres and made it into like a monument garden. I don't know, it sounds wrong, but that's how I remember reading it. But anyway.
Yeah, that's the one he describes as like if you wanted to meet someone there, it would be like meeting someone in the Gobi Desert, right?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Just this gigantic, empty, open space, and that's like designated spending time area, except it's also right smack in the center of the administrative buildings, and so no one goes there for leisure. So it's just this massive set of green spaces that are empty, that people don't use.
Yeah, I don't even think they have like benches or anything. Like of the pictures that I saw, it was just like a big flat patch of concrete, and that was it.
Yep.
Maybe a statue. Kind of funny to imagine him just like bringing a folding chair and just plopping it in the middle of like, a 200-acre patch of concrete, being like, yes, this is wonderful. Okay, and the last two like design principles were the roads were for automobile traffic only, so there was no like mixed use roads, and there were like huge setbacks for green space, so like all the buildings have giant yards around them. But again, it's not like pretty gardens or anything, it's like grass.
Yeah, and he did that on the basis of calculations, right? Like
yes.
Healthy citizens need X number of square footage of recreation and green space in order to live comfortably. And so that's how they broke up the city, was based on how many people they think will be living there. And that was, of course, a fixed, determined number in advance. They allocated a certain amount of green space. Yeah, that's right. Not a drop more. I don't know how they expected to make that work and not grow beyond that. Like, if you wanted it to be a functional city, why would it not grow? I guess the high modernist thing is control every aspect of their lives. So of course you're going to be controlling things like reproduction. But
yeah, birth control and the water supply.
Yep.
So it definitely departed from the design and culture of Brazil's existing cities. So they were successful in that sense. It was different.
It was a rejection.
Yeah. So rather than something like the favelas of Rio, which are, if you don't know, if you ever see those pictures of like the giant slums in Brazil, those are the favelas. They're like informal settlements. So instead of that, residents would live in those super quadros. But the benefits turned out to be kind of spurious, actually, surprisingly. So people who lived in the city as originally built said that in Brasilia there is only work and home, and they coined a term, which I think is pronounced Brasilite, for the condition of living in the city as if it were an illness.
Yep. They talked about how you only get to meet someone if you either see them at work or you go to their apartment. And so like all of this green space that's designated for leisure and like single use relaxation zones, they just don't get used. It's work and home.
Which I kind of feel like, I mean, obviously in pandemic times, we're only at home. But I feel like even prior to that, we were kind of entering a de facto version of that based on just all space being privatized. And like you go to work, and if you don't have enough money to like go out, then you just go home and hang out, and that's it.
Yep.
Let's see. Because the whole city was divided into single-purpose blocks, and because the blocks were separated by huge setbacks, there was nothing even close to mixed-use space. So, like somewhere, like you said, where someone might stop and meet on the way to or from work, they said like all meetings had to be planned, which I'm sure Le Corbusier was like, "Oh, that's great." And because the streets had no foot traffic, there were no street corners where people could have spontaneous meetings or gatherings, which makes the city feel dead or empty. So it's cars only. Although I did look at some newer pictures of Brasilia, and they have added footpaths. So there's like something like sidewalks. Yeah.
Completely spitting in the face of our high modernist overlords. I don't understand.
He is turning in his grave. Or maybe he's just like moving back and forth in a straight line in his grave because turning is
90-degree turns.
Disorderly. So because the Super Quadra were nominally egalitarian, they were all completely identical and had no character of any kind, not even a porch to decorate with some personality. So one of the design characteristics was like they had floor to ceiling windows. So like you were kind of like, it was, I think the closest comparison would be like an ant farm, basically. Like the whole side of the building like revealed everything that was inside.
Yeah.
Which made obviously people feel kind of violated. Like they didn't have like a real private life. But then again, there was no porch. So like, you know, even on those huge modernist apartment blocks that follow similar design principles where like everyone has the same unit, if you have a porch, you can like put some personality into it, but they didn't have that. So everyone just lived in a completely identical house, which I also have to imagine it made it really hard to find someone's house, even if you've been there a bunch of times.
Yeah, they talk about that at one point. Like all the streets look the same. There's no landmarks. There's nothing to help direct you or guide your way. So unless you know the sort of systematized top-down letter number grid system that they named the streets and everything with, you would have a hell of a time getting anywhere.
Yeah, they also said the streets they weren't like named anything. They just had these really complex acronyms that like hardly anyone could memorize, which is, I guess, pretty characteristic.
Yep.
The crazy thing to me, though, the city was built in 41 months by around 60,000 construction workers. And those workers who I think this might be a slur, but they're called candangos or condongos.
Yeah.
Which supposed to be translated to like an undifferentiated worker, like someone with no personality or soul or something like that, which I mean it makes it just sound like a slur. Apparently they took it back and Kubitschek kind of celebrated them.
Yeah, Kubitschek's plan was to like make it, this was the new birth of the Candangos as a class, that now they would be respected because they took part in the building of our glorious new city.
Yeah, I wonder how much that actually worked.
Yeah.
So yeah, those construction workers that built Brasilia, they created their own settlements on one hand because the settlements, the temporary settlements that were built for them to live while they built the city were like not adequate. But also because the intent was for them to leave when they were done, and they didn't want to do that. They lived there for several years, and they're like, well, we're just going to stay. So they managed to make their settlements permanent, both by the sympathies of Kubitschek, and his celebration of them as heroes, but also because of their collective power as a potential voting bloc, according to Scott, who said that, they had a functioning democracy. And so a group like them who operated as like a class could potentially, get someone else elected if you didn't make concessions to them. And so as of 1980, 75% of the population of Brasilia lived outside the planned city, in those unplanned settlements created by the workers.
Yeah, he mentioned that at one point, something like 70% of the city's intended occupation is like as high as it ever got for the actual, like the super quadra areas.
Mm-hmm.
So you have all this detailed, super minute planning, and then most people just live outside, completely outside of your planning, and you never actually get even the city itself to meet like your vision. So,
oh yeah, I forgot the other thing about the Super Quadra. Apparently, someone like asked a bunch of 9-year-old kids to draw a picture of home, and these were kids who lived in the Super Quadras, and they just drew like the traditional house shape with a pitched roof and chimney and windows and doors. So they did not think of it as home.
Yeah, none of the children drew apartment buildings. So despite the fact that they lived there all their lives. Yeah.
I wonder what the result would be if you asked like kids in New York or something to do the same thing.
Yeah, that would be an interesting question.
Because he did say it was like part of deeply embedded cultural conceptions of home. So maybe that's part of it, and it's not necessarily because of the Super Quadra thing. But I mean, if you live in a part of a square box with no personality, probably does have something to do with it, at least.
Yep.
Back to the unplanned settlement, 75% of the population lives there. And unfortunately, that part of the city is stratified like the typical Brazilian city. So the majority of the populace lives in slums around the periphery, and they commute long distances to work in the center, which is where the wealthy live.
So even that limited egalitarian dream of everyone having the same size home, and you sort of break down those social and class distinctions, goes straight out the window when the plan is not quite followed.
Yeah, I wonder what the class of the people who still live in the Super Quadras is. Like, I would imagine that the rich people like moved out to the unplanned city where they could get a bigger house.
Yep.
But I don't know, maybe the appeal of being near work makes up for it. But no, because then he talked about the lack of mixed space. So yeah, I have to imagine that they probably all went to get a mansion in the unplanned settlement.
Yeah. With how like poorly successful these designers were, they had this grand dream. They had all the land, and it was like built on a plateau, so it basically was flat. You didn't have to work around a river or anything. They had everything going for them, and it still worked out so poorly with regard to how they actually wanted it to go. I almost feel bad for them. Like, I don't think they were in the right or doing a good thing with it, but it just worked. It just didn't work, and they tried.
It's hard to have your dreams crushed any harder than that. Like,
yeah.
You get there, you have all of the resources in the world given to you, and you just fail utterly.
And it's crazy. Like known to this day as this miserable place to live that has like a social disease named after it. Like,
yeah. So yeah, the conclusion of this section by Scott is it was successful in doing something different, but not successful in its intended purpose of creating a new way of living.
Mm-hmm. Or inspiring others to take up that new way of living.
Right. So he has a very small section right after this about Chandigarh, which is another planned city.
This is the one that Le Corbusier actually got to design, right?
Yes. Yeah, so it was the new capital of Punjab. And it was originally being designed by Matthew Nowicki, who was a Polish designer. And while he was in the middle of it, he died suddenly in a plane crash, which to me, very suspicious, especially because it was caused by bad oil. Like there was a bunch of like sludge or something in the oil that caused an engine failure, which is one of the most common ways to sabotage a machine. And then, of course, right after this, Le Corbusier, the extreme authoritarian nut job, gets the job. So maybe some involvement there. I don't know. But so it was built at the behest of the first PM of the independent Indian nation, Jawaharlal Nehru, who chose Le Corbusier to pick up where Matthew left off. And Le Corbusier's role in the design was to take out all of the interesting and humanizing shit about a city and turn it into another big, stupid, empty line drawing. So there were like curves in the design that he removed. There were areas that would have caused crowds, and there were footpaths, and he took all of those out because he's a simple-minded, misanthropic freak. And so again, what happened was that the planned city remains completely dead and is surrounded by an unplanned city that's like lively and has people actually living there.
Poor Le Corbusier. Do you know where his name comes from, by the way?
Yes, I did look that up. It's like basically like tweak of his father's name.
Yeah, his grandmother's last name is what I found.
Oh, okay.
I spent a bunch of time looking into it because it doesn't mean anything. Like, Corbusier is not a French word. But yeah, he just took up a weird modification of some member of his family's name.
Le Corbusier.
Yeah.
Is the original. Yeah, it says it's his maternal grandfather's name. That's off Wikipedia, though, so could be wrong. I don't know. So that is the tale of Le Corbusier and his planned cities. And now we're getting to the part that you were most interested in, which is the critique of modernist urban planning by Jane Jacobs. So do you want to kick us off with your notes?
Yeah, I guess so. So what I find really interesting about this whole approach that Jacobs takes is that it's liberal-minded, you know, like she talks about how a more desirable city has things like crowds and multi-use areas, and that leads to things like increased property value. And so it's like very clearly at its root a liberal critique and perspective. And at the same time, it's arguing for a bottom-up social order that doesn't require policing or institutionalized order for things to work. And so you've got this like really interesting intersection between the obvious liberal provenance of her views and the conclusions that she makes, which are almost anarchist. And I find that really interesting.
Yeah, what happened to those liberals?
Yeah, right? Let's get some of those back.
So the book that he's talking about by Jane is The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which Scott says is not the first critique of modernist urban planning, but certainly the best one. So he says there's like an immediate apparent difference between Jacob and the rest of the modernists, where they approach the city from the administrator's view from far and above the city with no regard to life on the street level. She does the opposite. She starts from the street level. And I think part of this is he mentions that she was involved in like organizing campaigns against types of zoning that she disagreed with and stuff like that. So she was like involved in urban planning politically instead of, you know, the Le Corbusier way of just like shopping around to different authoritarians and trying to get, you know, them to let her demolish the whole city. So she starts from the human level. And she centers her critique on the fundamental confusion between function and visual order. So straight lines and neatness mean nothing in terms of functional use for residents, which is like the fundamental mistake that the urban modernists make. So for me, that made me think about like the typical messy desk.
Yeah.
There's like there's all these studies that I've seen. I mean, I haven't read a lot of them because I don't have time for that, but they supposedly show that people with messy desks are smarter or more productive or some shit like that. But I think the truth is more likely that the desks aren't really messy. They're just functional and ordered according to use. And so people who obsess over the visual appearance of their desk are devoting all this mental energy to make their desk less functional so that it looks better.
Yeah.
Which makes them less productive.
And you get people with like super messy desks that look utterly chaotic, but they can find things in there without hesitation. They know where things are. They know where everything is. And so the idea that just because it looks disorderly means that it is. So that's one of the big things that Jacobs rails against. She's got some burns in there, stuff like the highly complex ordered systems only look disordered to the untrained and ignorant. And Scott talks about that. He's like, when you actually look at the inside of like a living creature or the like a arrangement of plants or something, or the inside of an engine, you have all these really complex interconnected moving parts, pipes and wires and fancy things going on, a highly complex arrangement of leaves on a plant or parts of a flower or something. And if you don't know what's going on, you might say, well, that is clearly chaos and disorder. But then when you actually understand what's going on, it looks different to you. You start to recognize the patterns and the order that's actually contained in there. And so the only reason that someone would look at something like a city and go, that is chaotic and a mess, it's because they don't know any better. They don't understand the actual order. They're untrained. And I love that because like Le Corbusier goes so far out of his way to say that straight lines are the only thing that accounts as actual order. And Jacobs goes, you don't understand cities then.
Yeah, I like that kind of burn where, you know, it's just like simultaneously demonstrating that you understand something and the person who has been making all of these great appeals to how perfect their knowledge is doesn't know shit.
Yeah. And like worst of all, when it's someone like Le Corbusier doesn't know shit and also thinks that he has the right and intelligence and technique, or what's the word I'm trying to say? Expertise to dictate his views to everyone else.
Right. Oh, this was a good burn, I think. Jacob speculates that the utopian city planner's compulsion to create neat, orderly cities stems from an unsuitable aim of converting cities into disciplined works of art. I really like that.
Yeah. Everything's just about aesthetics at root. It's not about function. It's not about how things actually work or are in the real world. It's about like visual aesthetic.
Yeah, that's something that always interests me is getting into like some of the psychology of people like this, like people that I will never understand, you know. And that I think that makes sense out of a lot of what they think. So Jacobs brings up more recent innovations in city planning, which used newer statistical techniques and the advent of input-output tables, which are something that socialists are big fans of for, you know, central or decentral planning. Rosenkron and I were talking yesterday about what's that guy's name? Cockshot.
Okay, yeah.
Who supposedly proved that the labor theory value is correct using input-output tables and some specific Leontief inversions or something like that, like some specific matrix algebra technique. That's what I thought of when I read this part. But so the way that these techniques were applied in city design was basically for the optimization of crude metrics like square feet of shopping space or number of vehicles traveling across a road per minute.
Yeah.
Which I think are still used sometimes.
It's such a weird idea. Like, you are planning for a city. You have this scientific theory that says that healthy people need X square footage of shopping space, and so you zone for that. And then that's like the end of your planning for it. Like, it's almost irrelevant what kind of shopping is there. What matters is that we have our theory that says that all you need is certain square footage of shopping space. And like, doesn't it matter what is available, what kind of stores and what kind of shopping is done? But there's just no discussion of that.
Yeah, and it also, there's a Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Right, yeah.
Which he mentions some problems with that sort of metric, like the shopping space one, because they're trying to get this like pretty exact number. They end up creating like state created monopolies of like grocery stores and such, which basically means that like, everyone has to use this one designated shopping space, as opposed to a real city where, if one grocery shop is like better or more convenient than another, then people will go to that instead, and you figure something else out to do with the rest of the space. So yeah, she continues. She expands her view of public city in terms of city design, which this part was really interesting to me. I haven't really heard any of this stuff before. So rather than safety being an outcome of police or cops or pigs or wannabe pigs, it comes from like seemingly more abstract factors. So the ones that she mentions are a system of implicit and voluntary constraints, which is kind of vague, but I think it becomes clearer later on. A clear demarcation between public and private space, and most importantly, an active population in the streets. And I would just add like a lack of like environmental collective trauma, which, in slums, you have like mass deprivation and neglect, which like causes collective trauma, and trauma leads to, increased violence or sensitivity, or what have you. But I guess that's just outside the scope of this.
Scott talks at one point about like some projects that were tried in like urban housing development with like the rectangular lawn and how everyone hated it. And you have people
I think he said it was
sometimes
in
Harlem. People being forcibly moved in there, sometimes just placed in this like hostile, alienating community.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all, of course, single use. He said you can't like buy a newspaper. There's nowhere to shop for anything because that's not what this area is for. It is a residential area. Yeah.
There's actually a really good video that I will recommend about trauma. It was done by Vida from Champagne Sharks, and when I looked at it the other day, it didn't have a ton of views, and I think it should get more. So I'm going to link it in the show description actually, because it's great, and it talks about collective trauma and social services and things like that. And I think she's going to do more on the subject because she was educated in social work or got involved in social work, but not like state social workers. Like she wasn't very clear on what it actually was, but she basically was like in the position to help people in high trauma environments, and so she has a lot of understanding of that subject. But yeah, that's the main reason I actually thought of that point, was because it's pretty fresh in my mind. But anyway, so Jacobs also writes about a series of small but important public services, like microservices provided by people who have like a passing familiarity to one another. Which, what did she call it? Street
terms.
Yeah, street terms. Yeah, people who are on street terms with one another, and especially by like small shop owners who, are becoming increasingly rare today, especially through the pandemic. People not being able to keep their business above water and pay their rent. We might end up with like most of those places being replaced by large corporations who are able to weather the storm.
Yeah. There's a little corner store right across from my place, and they're in the process of being evicted. I go there all the time, and It's just going to be gone. It's
turned into a 7-Eleven or something.
More than likely, the space is just going to sit vacant for years. So, good on you, system. You did great.
Yeah. So the services that she's talking about are like trusting people that are just around you to like watch your child or a bike for a minute, like to go to the bathroom or get a sandwich or something. Or an example that I thought was really interesting that I've like never heard of before in my life, which was there were certain shopkeepers in some neighborhoods where if you needed to leave a key for someone to get into your apartment because you were leaving, you could give it to a shopkeeper who would just have a drawer full of house keys or like spare keys. And you could just go and ask for it, and you would be able to get into your friend's apartment. Have you ever heard of anything like that?
I have heard of like neighbors doing that for people, but I've never lived anywhere that had a ton of businesses in and around the housing areas. Grew up in the suburbs, and now I live in a city, but with a lot of, it's just apartment buildings down my block, other than that one little corner store. So if you lived on like a more main street, like an apartment above a store, I can see that dynamic emerging a little more readily, but it's not something that I've ever seen personally.
I can't even think of like that happening in a TV show or anything that I would have seen, you know? That's an interesting dynamic.
So this sort of issue of public safety, and that happens as an aggregate of all these little social interactions, each of which is insignificant, but like in aggregate, they're huge. You have a lot of eyes watching the street at a given time, which makes it safe for kids to play there. And so they prefer to play there over like larger designated areas like parks, which are a lot less safe. That's one thing that Scott comments on. And all of this stuff... And
also because they're more lively. Like there's more stuff happening on the street. Yeah.
So all of this stuff, like you can't institutionalize it. You can't have like go to your city government and elect a commission of street safety to have a bunch of government suits stand on the street and watch things and replicate this dynamic. Like it's impossible.
Pay like 300 people to walk down a street all day.
So the only way that this works is, I don't remember what the exact wording was, but it's something like the social relations are part of the logic of the existing relationships that are there. So like the business relationships have this logic where they value having customers who want to come there and lots of people who feel safe. And so it's embedded in the logic of how the area works, and you can't just institutionalize that. One thing that was interesting is they have no private commitments, so there's no formal contracts for it, and everyone involved is a non-specialist. No one is a security guard or someone who is paid to watch. They're all people that are there for other reasons and have their own business of some sort, and that they are then able to act as these non-specialists contributing to the aggregate safety.
He also talked about how her gender might have factored into this understanding.
Yes. I had a whole thing about that because it's a very weird passage. What did you think about that? Like, do you think Scott's right that those things that he talked about are factors of the gender?
I mean, I guess it's probably a little essentializing, but I don't think he's completely wrong that men probably are more likely to view things in an instrumental way.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think?
Having that sort of business-oriented, single-purpose mindset that makes the sort of urban planning easier.
Especially the safety stuff, because I don't think men think of safety very much at all. That's
true. Yeah, they just don't really consider that.
I'll just pull out my gun, you know?
But just everyone's heard the dynamic of, I don't feel safe walking home down that street at night. And the men in the room go, oh, I just had never even considered it, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, maybe there is something to that, like,
and it's always when the street is empty, isn't it?
Yep. So, yeah, so one of the things she talks about is how these areas are, like, intrinsically desirable. Like, people want to go there because there's a lot of things to do there. It's mixed-use areas. A lot of people live there, and also it's shopping. That's the areas that she talks about mainly. And because those areas are intrinsically desirable, you're going to have more people there, which makes them more safe and also successful by liberal and capitalist metrics. That was the land value argument. But all of this happening just from the bottom up, from I have a multi-use district and people want to be there, and everything else in terms of like social cohesion and safety just follows from that, as long as people are on sidewalk terms. And there's that whole trauma issue you mentioned, but it just sort of emerges. And that couldn't possibly be replicated by single-use districts being planned from above.
Yeah, they I don't remember if it was Scott or Jacobs saying this, but they were talking about how these types of communities are also more resilient, like having a mix of different types of buildings, like, you know, business versus residential, or both in one building, and different like ages of buildings and businesses and residents. Leads to them being more resilient. So if there's an economic downturn like we're going through now, they're more likely to survive because, you know, there's more established businesses, you know, that might be like neighborhood fixtures, and more diverse things tend to be less brittle, much like the forest from the first chapter. The more stuff you take out and make uniform, the harder it is for it to survive unexpected factors, or catastrophes.
So I've got a quote written down here, which is neat. I think this was something Jacob said specifically. It might have been Scott, but she said, cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everyone. So it's sort of this, it's that opposite perspective, bottom up instead of top down, almost like a radical democracy view of everyone having a say, and certainly not one dictatorial planner asserting from above.
Yeah, the bottom up thing, I think, makes a lot of sense. Especially for a city, like, people understand what they need in their own place than, you know, someone who's never been there or doesn't live there does. Generally, anyway.
The long-term residents, there's concerns about like people just moving in and changing things, but people who have lived there. And
and another thing that I was thinking about with the diverse buildings aspect is I recently did an episode of the show about housing policy, and it was about like NIMBYs versus EMBs, who, you know, are both bad in their own way, but this one made me think of the YIMBYs, where like they basically want to like get rid of all the buildings that they can to build new housing, which would make everything very uniform, like uniformly new. Although according to them, it would be market rate for low income people, which made no sense to me. I don't understand how that's supposed to work. If it's market rate, it's not affordable. But anyway, the point is I think their plans would make communities very brittle and not able to weather downturns. But I think this stuff about zoning laws is very interesting too. Like, that's one of those things you never really think about. A lot of it, at least in my area, is controlled by like the county boards. They decide how things are zoned. I live in a suburb of Washington, D.C. And like the county boards of supervisors, the main thing that they do is make decisions about zoning. And it's just one of those things where you kind of never think about it until someone explains to you why it matters and like what the effects of it are, because it just seems so innocuous.
Scott mentioned that Jacobs was like involved in activism and campaigns to stop the changing of zoning laws in her area.
Right.
So that's kind of neat. She's sort of putting that view into practice, and I don't know if that's most compelling practice that I've heard of, but I can see why she focuses on it, especially since the like very nature of the zoning plays a serious role in her view of the city and how it should work and how it could be better.
Yeah.
So I've got one last thing here. So do you remember the end of the chapter? She talks about this sort of language metaphor. So do you do linguistic stuff? I have some passing interest in linguistics, and it made me think of a bunch of things. But
I have a small amount of knowledge about it. I learned Esperanto for a little bit in like 6th or 7th grade, I think. I was in one of those fucking gifted programs, and that was one of the things that we did was learn Esperanto. But even at that age, I was like, this is kind of dumb. Like, who the fuck speaks Esperanto? So I never really learned much of it.
Well, that's good, because
also
now when I
weird.
talk
I also
about...
thought it was weird that it was supposed to be like a universal language, but it's basically based off of like Latin and Spanish. It's
like
so
5
there's no
European
like Chinese
languages.
influence or anything. Like,
Yeah, there's a couple that try and do better than that. Lojban has Mandarin loanwords and a couple, but none of them are particularly good at avoiding like cultural centrism, Eurocentrism. Okay, so I'm glad that you're not like a linguistics expert, because I'm going to talk about a couple linguistics things, and I'm probably going to get the terms wrong. And people that really know linguistics hate when you do that. So, okay. So she makes a comparison between the development of a city to the development of a language. So she's not completely opposed to any kind of planning. She doesn't say that you should just take your hands completely off, but you can't sort of put your own plans into effect with no regard to what the people naturally do. And so the best you can really hope for is to nudge it in a more desirable direction with sensible and low impact reforms and changes kind of thing. What I thought was really interesting about that is the process of natural language evolution is also a system of immense complexity when left to human devices, but then it stops being when you develop writing. And what I find interesting is that most language reforms come from I don't know of any pre-writing languages that have had significant reforms come through. But once you have writing, and then you have like an institution that wants to standardize and universalize a language, that's when things get set in stone and they stop changing. They stop evolving and going through the natural process of language evolution that languages normally go through. And so just the very existence of writing puts it into this artificial frozen state. And I have to wonder, like, to what extent does her view on how much, what would I call it? Like, the kinds of reforms and planning that she think is acceptable or good, would not like freeze and make it, artificially change things in a way that wouldn't be expected. To the extent that you think that those, natural ways that people organize themselves in cities are desirable, it doesn't take much in a language, for example, to freeze everything. So the example, and let me think, I had a couple examples thought of. So the older a language is, without having developed writing, the more complex it gets. I believe, and I shouldn't get this wrong, anyone who knows about linguistics, log off now.
That's
the Navajo language. Yeah. The Navajo language is known for being extremely complex. If I recall correctly, it takes like 13 years for someone to, or it's said that it takes 13 years to become fully competent in the language, which like children can use it and engage with it and express themselves in that, but like proper mastery just doesn't come until later because it's so complex. And that language didn't develop writing of any sort until the 1930s, when it was artificially given orthography. Someone created a Latin-derived alphabet for it and sort of said, you can write using this now, kind of thing. But it wasn't a natural development. And to my knowledge, the writing that did come to exist mainly came from, originally started up as like ledgers, keeping track of things like grain. That's where writing systems really emerge in normal languages. And so you just didn't have that in the Navajo-speaking areas. And now, of course, Navajo
that is one thing that I do know a bit about.
Okay.
There's somewhat of a historical debate about whether ledgers came first, or like basically whether writing was created by the state or created by like from the bottom up, basically, and adopted by the state. But there's not really very strong evidence one way or the other. I don't think it's not like there's, writing samples from before states could have possibly existed or anything like that.
Sure.
But anyway.
Okay. So yeah, I'm focusing on this because I find it interesting with the metaphor, but at the same time, it's just an analogy to language. So if languages are sort of frozen in time and stopped from evolving through the introduction of language, you can see that that's what's desired from a high modernist perspective. You have your design and plan and you put it into play and you don't want it changing after that point, or at least the high modernists who are pushing that don't want it to be changed. But then when you have someone who is actually arguing for the positive nature of people's self-organizations in the natural way, that doesn't happen when you have a bunch of top-down planning. And you also have Jacob saying things like she really values the sort of endless process of change. It's all that stuff that Scott says about she's not this form of conservative thinking that just everything that is as it is good.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest difference is like that she doesn't think everything is good, but like trying to impose things from the top down is like worse, almost no matter what.
So I guess, what do you think these kinds of changes and smaller scale bottom up modifications and plans where people are given the power to actually make it themselves, what do you think that would look like in terms that would actually work?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess like the thing you made me think of with the writing analogy is just the idea of zoning laws in the first place. Like, there's probably no fixing them because once you say that like this space is for this, then that's kind of it until you change the law, which there's always resistance to. Yeah, and I guess generally like you want, especially like human spaces, to be something that you can always change if it stops working.
Well, that's an interesting connection. Just
I think I lost track of the question though.
No, that's interesting. Like my whole thought was the development of language. As soon as you bring in writing, that's what freezes things. And then in the city side, if we're thinking about things like zoning laws, as soon as you develop the written law, that's what freezes things. So it's writing both times. Conclusion, writing is bad.
And I wonder if it's like, I don't know if you have like read anything about this, but I wonder if it's writing specifically or like writing prescribed by like an academy. So like, I think it was in the episode with Sam, we talked about the Académie Française, which is like a centralized authority that supposedly like determines proper French, essentially. And so the way to write French would be determined by them. But in English, we don't really have that. Although we do have like dictionaries sort of fill that purpose because there's several prescriptive English dictionaries. Yeah.
So the way, and I'm not an expert in this, but the way that I understand it as going is when you have an institutional prescription like the Académie Française, whatever, that really like aggressively cements it. But even without such a formal institutionalized set of rules, it still does restrict the sort of language development that happens as long as that written communication is happening over long distances. Because locally, dialects continue to evolve. People change how they speak in the sort of local sphere, but then you have this thing where people speak one way and then write a different way such that it becomes more intelligible to people that aren't in their local area and demographic who have that shared dialect.
I also wonder if a lot of it has to do with like the fact that most of us are employed now. So a huge part of our use of language is in the workplace where you're dictated a certain way of speaking more than you are informally. Because like definitely there's more slang in informal parts of society. Like I think maybe not the best example, but like slang for drugs evolves like so quickly. Like there's always new words for various drugs. Yep. And I'm sure part of it is like there's no specific like accepted term that comes from above that you're supposed to use. but I guess also just
Yeah.
that you want to be kind of more surreptitious about it.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, like, there are certain communities that use things like euphemism and slang terms more than others in more of a utilitarian way. It's not so much a product of natural language evolution than it is the surreptitious nature of it. You're doing it for a reason, you know?
Yeah.
What I'm thinking is, I don't know why I thought of this example, but like Scottish people, for example, you have Scots, which is essentially English, but it's like more or less intelligible depending on how it's written or spoken. And you can write it. You can write, there were poets that wrote in Scots rather than in like conventional English, and it's mostly intelligible with English. But at the same time, if a Scottish person who speaks that way went onto like an American website and typed that way, like Reddit has Scottish people Twitter, and it's just people talking that way and making fun of people, or not making fun, it's positive. But commenting on those, that way of speaking and writing. And of course, all the comments are, I don't understand a damn thing that's being said here. So of course you have to modify. So even it almost doesn't matter how far the local dialect goes in terms of intelligibility in the spoken word, you will always adapt and modify your writing in a way that's intelligible to the speakers. And so then you don't need an Académie Française to be dictating how to use the written language, because you're forced to do that just by the way that distance and different dialects develop.
So there were several comparisons in this chapter of the planned city to the factory, which on its surface is like a, pretty interesting comparison. Le Corbusier said that he liked the factory because it was basically like one mind deciding like the form and operation of it and stuff like that. But I think the comparison goes even a little deeper than they discuss in the book. One of the main appeals of the factory, and like one of the main reasons it like supplanted the workshop, which is how industry was done prior to the domination of factories. One of the reasons that it dominated was the ability to surveil workers and keep them from slacking off. So that means there is a uniformity of purpose in the factory. It's like a single use district of the city. Like you only do work there, and you only do the work that the bosses tell you. So there's like no socialization or rest, other than like, what the boss might mandate, during like year 15 or whatever. Because that would lower the utilization rate of the factory, and make it less productive in the eyes of the manager. But in reality, on the ground, these activities can make workers more productive if you have more time to rest. If you want to fuck off from work, you're not going to work as well as you would if you're like completely committed to it. If you're distracted or kind of tired, you're going to do like lower quality work or lower quantity work. Like no one does their best work by keeping their nose to the grindstone all day. And contrary to the views of the planners, workers can actually come up with good improvements to like both the process and the product that they're making or participating in if they're like allowed time to think about it. So if they were like allowed to socialize and rest freely, then it would probably make things work better than they do in a factory. And I think that relates to kind of what they were saying about cities.
Yeah, it's given the people, if the people have the ability to sort of contribute to the area that they live in and make their own decisions. That was Jacob's whole argument about the slums, that you can't just like top down declare this area to be razed to the ground and then you'll just eradicate that poverty or whatever. As long as the sort of conditions in the surrounding area are okay and people are given the ability to make their own decisions, this process of deslumification happens and the areas and conditions improve. And yeah, I don't know how much I really agree with Jacob's assessment that like the best way to deal with slums is to just leave them and let the people work it out. But I do like the idea that it's the people at that point making the decisions, and to the extent that you're pulling yourself out, it's, the people doing it themselves, not someone just dictating from on high.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the main thing that she's missing is that like the state, which I want to make sure that people don't think I'm just saying the government, like the state as in the government and business form this big giant rationing system that we're all subject to in modern society. And slums are basically like one of the products of class-based rationing. And so the thing that would allow the slums to flourish and become like not slums anymore would be if those people were not subject to rationing based on their lower class. And in combination with like having the capacity to decide things for themselves, obviously, I think that would be the thing that lets them develop beyond slums. So like even if there's no like zoning laws or anything like that are imposed on them, they still aren't like completely free. And the reason for that is because, resources are under the control of this higher order of class division.
Sort of a positive freedoms and negative freedoms dynamic. You can take the restrictions and zoning issues off, like those restrictions off of people, but that doesn't necessarily get you there. But yeah, it doesn't seem like Jacob's analysis really has room for that. It is a liberal one at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, good luck talking about something like that too. A liberal who's not like ready for it. Oh, and I guess we didn't really mention a lot about how like so many of these modernists talked about like raising the slums, basically, like how the slums are. It's like how fascists think of homelessness now. It's just this problem to be dealt with through like eradication, essentially.
Forced relocation into your super quadra or whatever.
Or not even that. Yeah. It seems like a lot of them are just like, well, just, see ya, whatever.
Yeah, I guess Le Corbusier has his La Pourriture thing. Like, if you view them as garbage, as rot, then you're going to treat them accordingly.
All right. Well, I think that's all I have. And sounds like that's all you have as well. So did you want to talk about your upcoming channel a little bit?
Sure. Okay. So I have a YouTube channel that I am trying to create. It's going to be my project that I'm working on right now is audiobook recordings of the entirety of Davide Torquato's The Method of Freedom, which is an Enrico Malatesta reader, chronologically ordered. So the earliest stuff is from early in his life and the later stuff is near his death. And so I've got, I think, 5 works through and only one of them is uploaded. So I don't have anything to share right now, but if anyone's interested in some Malatesta audiobooks in the future, keep an eye out.
And you said you're trying to get them on Audible too, right?
I'm thinking about that. Yeah. And really that motivation is more getting it to like the technical standards, like a baseline of listenability.
Gotcha.
Where if I could theoretically get it onto Audible's program, but what I do plan on doing is uploading a bunch of it to Audible Anarchist and LibriVox, which is a project for recording audiobook versions of public domain works.
Cool. Well, Tura, thank you so much for coming on and reading this chapter with me.
Thanks for having me. Any linguists in the audience, I apologize.
I think Sam and I actually talked about, I think he brought up the Inuit language having like a writing system created for it like fairly recently.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So like the pattern is the longer a language goes without having a writing system, the more complex it gets. But then in the modern world, there have been a number of those languages that have had sort of writing imposed, either as like a tool of imperialism or just out of practical usage. And it's actually like desired and advocated for by the people, but a lot of the time it's not. But yeah, it's an interesting story.
Yeah. Great. Well, yeah, thanks again for coming on. I hope to have you on again sometime.
Yeah, I'd like that. Hopefully I will have read Capital is Power by then.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
See you, everyone.